The greenhouse stood at the edge of the property for 31 years, and in all that time, no one was ever invited inside. Neighbors along County Road 7 watched the glass panels fog each winter morning and clear by noon. They watched the grow light pulse on at dusk through all 4 seasons. They watched Warren Callum walk the gravel path to the padlocked door every single day, alone, until the day he couldn't anymore. Nobody asked what he was tending. In Harlan Falls, you didn't ask a quiet man about his quiet places. He left behind very little that made sense at first. A clapboard house, swept clean, a shed with tools hung in order on pegboard, a letter sealed with tape and left with the county attorney, addressed to a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 11 years, instructing her, and only her, to come to the property, find the pry bar in the shed, and open the floor of the greenhouse herself. Not a contractor, not a lawyer. Her. The letter said she would understand when she got there. It said she would need to sit with it for a while before she did anything at all. Nora Callum drove 4 hours on a Wednesday in November, the sky low and white, the highway narrowing beneath her tires from pavement to gravel to a dirt road that felt like the world was quietly closing behind her. She had spent 11 years building a version of her father that explained the silence. A cold man, a withholding man, a man who chose distance the way other men chose drink. She had made peace with that version. She had needed it to be true. The drive undid her slowly. A gas station attendant said Warren's name and smiled before she said a word. What she found beneath that cedar floor was not what she expected. What she found in his handwriting, 4 pages dated March 3rd, written 2 years before he died, was a man she had never been allowed to meet. What she found in the cloth-wrapped bundle, in the sealed documents, in the deed to a stone mill on County Road 14 paid off in 1998, was 31 years of a life lived almost entirely for other people, conducted in complete silence, with no audience and no expectation of one. This is the story of what a man hides when he believes love is best expressed from a distance. It is the story of a greenhouse that was never really about plants. It is the story of a floor that held more than money. It held an apology, a confession, and a gift that took a lifetime to prepare. Some inheritances arrive in envelopes. Some arrive in the calluses on a dead man's hands, in the neighbors who show up without being called, in the chair left pulled up to the center of the floor, as though he knew someday she would sit there and finally understand. The phone rang on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of November, and Nora Callum let it ring twice before she answered it. She was standing at the kitchen counter in her apartment in Roanoke, still in yesterday's clothes, a mug of coffee going cold beside the sink. The apartment was small and getting smaller. 3 cardboard boxes sat near the door, half-packed, the remnants of a life she was in the middle of dismantling box by box. She picked up the phone on the 3rd ring. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gerald Marsh, an attorney with an office in Harlan Falls. He spoke the way small-town attorneys speak, measured, unhurried, each word given its full weight. He said he was calling on behalf of the estate of Warren Allen Callum. He said that name the way you say a name to someone who might need a moment to absorb it. Nora set her coffee mug down and pressed her back against the counter. She hadn't heard her father's name spoken aloud in a long time. Warren Callum had died on October 22nd, a Tuesday, at home, of a heart that had been working too hard for too many years. He was 67. The funeral had already passed. A small thing, Marsh said, per Warren's instructions. There had been no obituary placed in any paper. Warren had arranged for a plain pine box, a short service, and a burial in the county cemetery on Route 9, beside a woman named Ruth who had died in 1993. Nora's mother. Nora pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and said nothing for a moment. Marsh waited. The estate, Marsh explained, was not complicated. There was the house on County Road 7. There was a modest savings account holding $4,011. And there was the greenhouse, a large Victorian-style structure of cedar framing and old single-pane glass attached to the rear of the property, which Warren had padlocked 6 months before his death and for which he had left specific instructions. Marsh paused here in a way that made Nora straighten up from the counter. The instructions, he said carefully, were addressed to her by name, not to an estate executor, not to a contractor or an appraiser. To Nora, specifically, in Warren's own handwriting. She asked what the instructions said. Marsh told her he was only permitted to read the relevant portion. He heard papers shuffling on his end, then his voice again. She is to come to the property in person. She is to go to the shed on the north side of the house and retrieve the pry bar and the box of lag screws on the second shelf. She is to open the floor of the greenhouse herself, beginning with panel number 1. She will understand when she gets there. She should plan to sit with what she finds before she does anything at all. Marsh stopped reading. There was a short silence on the line. Nora said, "Open the floor." It was not quite a question. She spent the next hour standing in her apartment, not packing boxes. The coffee went fully cold. Outside, the November sky pressed flat and gray over the rooftops of Roanoke, and a thin rain had begun to collect on the windowsills. She hadn't spoken to Warren in 11 years. The last conversation had been short and unpleasant, conducted over a bad phone connection, and she had been the one to hang up. In the years after, she had occasionally thought about calling. She never had. She had told herself it was his turn. Now it was nobody's turn. The situation she was in when the phone rang was not one she would have chosen to be in. Her husband, Dennis, had died 14 months earlier. An aneurysm, fast and without warning, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning in September. He was 41. The life insurance had covered the funeral and 4 months of rent. After that, Nora had sold what she could, picked up part-time bookkeeping work through a temp agency, and reduced her expenses to the point where there was nothing left to reduce. The boxes by the door were headed to a storage unit she could barely afford. She was moving in with a friend from her old job until she figured out what came next. She had not yet figured out what came next. She called Marsh back that afternoon and told him she could be in Harlan Falls by the following Wednesday. He said that would be fine. He told her the key to the house was in a lockbox on the front door, and the combination was the last 4 digits of her childhood phone number. She wrote it down on the back of an envelope and stood staring at it for a moment after she hung up. Her father had set that combination sometime in the past year. He had remembered the number. He had used it on purpose. She spent the days before the drive doing what she always did when she didn't know how to feel about something. She kept busy. She finished packing the boxes. She moved them to the storage unit. She ate food that required no cooking and slept poorly and woke before the alarm each morning with a particular kind of hollow alertness that she recognized as grief, though she wasn't certain yet what exactly she was grieving. She had lost her father twice, once 11 years ago over a phone line, and once 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday she hadn't known about until a Thursday attorney called to tell her. She wasn't sure which loss was heavier. She wasn't ready to find out. On Wednesday morning, she loaded a canvas duffel into the back of her car, a 2009 Subaru with 140,000 miles on the odometer and a rear wiper that only worked in one direction. She had a thermos of coffee, a road atlas she'd had since college, and Gerald Marsh's card tucked into the sun visor. The drive would take 4 hours if she didn't stop. She planned to stop once, somewhere past the state line, to get her bearings and drink the coffee while it was still warm. She pulled out of the parking lot of her nearly empty apartment building and pointed the car south and east toward a piece of property she had never seen, belonging to a man she had convinced herself she knew. The rain from earlier in the week had moved on. The sky was pale and cold and very clear. The highway out of Roanoke was broad and fast and familiar, the kind of road that lets you drive without thinking, which was the last thing Nora needed. She kept the radio off. The heater fan ran on its lowest setting and pushed warm air across the dash in a thin, steady stream. The atlas was open on the passenger seat to the page she had marked the night before, though she had already memorized the route. Past the state line, she would pick up Route 63 heading northeast, follow it until it narrowed, and then take County Road 7 the last 9 miles to the property. She had traced the roads with her finger 3 times the night before, the way you check a door you already know is locked. The landscape changed gradually as she drove, the way landscapes do when you are paying attention. The interstate gave way to a 2-lane state route that ran between low hills covered in bare November timber, the trees stripped clean and standing in their thousands like something waiting. Small farms appeared at intervals, a tobacco barn listing slightly to the east, a hayfield gone brown and flat, a hand-painted sign at the end of a gravel drive that read, "Firewood split 4-foot lengths," with a phone number below it. Nora passed a volunteer fire station with 2 trucks visible through the open bay doors and a flag that snapped hard in the wind off the ridge. She had not been in this part of the state in more than a decade. It looked exactly as she remembered it, and nothing like she remembered it at the same time. She stopped for coffee at a service station 12 miles past the county line. The station was a low cinder block building with 2 pumps and a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising live bait and motor oil and a Tuesday lunch special that appeared to be the same every Tuesday. A bell above the door rang when she pushed it open. The man behind the counter was somewhere past 70, with a face like a topographic map and a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat. He had a small television on the shelf behind him, showing a weather forecast with the sound turned all the way down. He nodded at her when she came in and went back to filling out something on a clipboard. She poured coffee from a glass carafe that had been sitting on its burner long enough to turn the coffee the color of creek water in August. She paid $1.15 and stood at the counter while the man made her change. She wasn't sure why she did it. She would wonder about it later. But she said her father's name. She said she was headed to the Callum place on County Road 7, that Warren Callum had been her father, that he had recently passed. The man looked up from his clipboard. He set down his pen. He said, without any particular ceremony, that Warren had fixed his roof the winter of 2009 after the ice storm took out a 40-foot section of soffit along the east side of the building. Said he showed up with a truck full of lumber and a nail gun and worked 2 days straight in February cold and wouldn't take $1 for it. Said when he tried anyway, Warren told him to buy his bait here for the next year instead. The man shook his head slowly. He said, "Good man. Quiet man. I'm sorry for your loss." Nora took her coffee back to the car and sat in the parking lot for a moment without starting the engine. The coffee was bad. She drank half of it anyway. She had known on some level that her father was not a bad person. That had never been the accusation. The accusation, unspoken, built over years, assembled from small silenced and missed occasions and a last phone call that ended badly, was that he was absent, that he was withholding, that he had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to be somewhere else in all the ways that counted. The gas station man's story didn't disprove that, but it added something she hadn't had before. A second data point. A version of her father standing in February cold with a nail gun, not asking for anything. She followed the route the rest of the way without stopping. The state route became Route 63, and 63 narrowed until the center line disappeared, and the trees came in close on both sides, their bare branches meeting overhead and making a gray tunnel of the road. She passed a church with a gravel parking lot. She passed a cluster of mailboxes at the junction with County Road 7 and turned left onto a packed dirt surface that ran along the edge of a harvested cornfield. The stalks cut low and frost white in the mid-morning light. The world was closing in around her in the way it does when you are getting somewhere specific. The Subaru's tires made a different sound on the dirt. She slowed without thinking about it. 2 miles down County Road 7, she passed a farmhouse set back behind a wooden fence. A washing line strung between 2 posts with nothing on it. A vegetable garden gone to frost and straw. An older woman was crossing the yard with a basket under her arm. She looked up as Nora's car passed. Nora raised a hand from the wheel. The woman raised hers back, then stood watching until the car was passed. Nora saw her in the rearview mirror for a moment, a still figure against a pale sky. And then the road curved, and she was gone. The property appeared at the end of a short gravel lane marked by a rusted rural free delivery box with the number 714 on the side in stick-on numbers, one of them hanging loose. Nora turned in and let the car roll to a stop. Through the windshield she could see the house, white clapboard, single story, a covered porch running the full width of the front. And behind it, rising above the roofline, the glass panels of the greenhouse catching the flat November light. Even from the lane she could see the faint green inside. She could see something glowing, very faintly, behind the glass. A grow light, still running, still tending whatever her father had left behind. She turned off the engine. The silence came in fast and complete the way silence does in the country, filling the space the motor had left. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the house where her father had lived without her for 11 years, and before that, with her, for the first 16 years of her life. She was trying to decide what she felt. It was not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was something more like the feeling of arriving somewhere you have been before in a dream, familiar in shape, foreign in detail, impossible to fully trust. She wiped her face on the back of her hand. She got out of the car. The lockbox was exactly where Marsh had said it would be, hanging on a short chain from the door handle, a black plastic box the size of a deck of cards with a 4-digit tumbler on the front. Nora stood on the porch and dialed in the number from the back of the envelope, 7241, and the latch opened on the first try. The key inside was a standard brass house key, worn smooth at the bow from years of use, the kind of key that has been picked up and set down 10,000 times. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open, and stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The house was cold but not damp. Someone had turned the thermostat down rather than off, and the baseboard heaters ticked quietly in the rooms beyond the entry hall. The air smelled of dust and something faintly herbal, dried lavender maybe, or the ghost of it. And beneath that, the particular neutral smell of a house that has been sitting orderly and unoccupied for several weeks. A pair of work boots stood beside the door, toes pointing out, heels together, as though the man who left them there intended to come back for them. Nora stepped around them and went into the kitchen. The kitchen was plain and very clean. White metal cabinets, a porcelain sink with separate hot and cold taps, a 4-burner gas range with the grate scrubbed down to bare iron. On the counter beside the range sat a coffee percolator, and next to it a small notepad with a single line written in pencil in her father's handwriting. Filters in the second drawer, coffee in the freezer. She opened the second drawer. The filters were there. She opened the freezer and found a paper bag of ground coffee from a hardware store in Harlan Falls, folded over twice at the top and held with a rubber band. She stood holding it for a moment. Then she set it on the counter and left the kitchen to see the rest of the house. There were 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. The larger bedroom had been Warren's, an iron frame bed made tight as a military bunk, a single nightstand with a lamp and a library book 3 weeks overdue, a chest of drawers with nothing on top of it. The smaller room had been Nora's, the last summer she spent here. The bed was still there, a twin with a blue coverlet, and on the shelf above the window were 3 objects she recognized. A small ceramic horse she had made in a school art class, a field guide to birds of the mid-Atlantic states with a broken spine, and a coffee can lid she had painted red and gold at age 12 for a reason she could no longer remember. Warren had kept them on that shelf for 22 years. She did not pick any of them up. She pressed her back against the doorframe and looked at them from across the room. She spent 20 minutes in the house before she went to find the greenhouse. She made coffee in the percolator and drank half a cup standing at the kitchen window while it was still too hot, watching the gravel path that ran from the back porch to the greenhouse door. The path was clean. No weeds in the gravel, no grass pushing through the edges. Someone had maintained it recently. The greenhouse itself was large, larger than it had looked from the lane, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a ridge vent running the full length of the roof and cedar framing that had weathered to a soft pewter gray. The glass was old, slightly wavy in the way old single-pane glass goes, and it held the pale sky in it like water in a shallow tray. The padlock was a Masterlock Model 175, the wide shackle version, the kind used on storage units and equipment sheds and anywhere the intention is to be taken seriously. It was new, newer than anything else on the property, and it sat on a hasp that had been recently lag-screwed into the cedar door frame with hardware that still held its zinc plating. Warren had installed it within the past year. The screws were bright. Nora tested the lock once with her thumb, and then stepped back and looked at the greenhouse through its glass walls. Inside, rows of planting beds ran the length of the structure. Tomatoes, still going in November, staked to cedar lath with strips of cotton cloth. Lettuces in shallow trays. A rosemary bush in a half-barrel near the far end that had grown large enough to be a small tree. And the grow light, a single broad-spectrum fixture hanging on a chain from the ridge beam, running on its timer, casting a warm amber rectangle across the center of the floor. It was the floor that stopped her. She pressed her face lightly against the cold glass and looked at it. The greenhouse floor was cedar planking, tongue and groove, the same material as the framing. Not unusual. What was unusual was the chair. A folding aluminum chair with a green nylon seat, the kind sold at hardware stores for $9, had been placed in the dead center of the floor, facing nothing in particular, positioned not at a planting bed or a workbench but aimed directly downward, as though whoever sat in it had been in the habit of looking at the floor itself. The chair was not a working chair. It was a sitting chair. A thinking chair. It had been placed there on purpose, and it had been used, and it faced the floor. Nora straightened up from the glass and stood in the cold with her coffee cup and looked at the padlock. The attorney's instructions were in the sealed envelope she hadn't opened yet, tucked into her duffel bag in the car. She had been putting off opening it the way you put off the last page of something you are not ready to be finished with. She went back inside through the porch, retrieved the envelope from her bag, and brought it to the kitchen table. She set it down and looked at it. Her name was written on the front in her father's handwriting. The same handwriting as the notepad on the counter, the same careful block letters he had always used. Every character formed as though legibility were a matter of courtesy. She turned it over. The flap was sealed with tape and signed across the seal in pencil. She got up and found a butter knife in the second drawer, the same drawer as the coffee filters, and worked the tape loose without tearing the envelope. Then she sat back down and began to read. The attorney's instructions were 2 pages, written front and back on lined paper, in the same block letters as the notepad. They began without preamble. The shed on the north side of the house, Warren had written, has a green metal door with a slide bolt. The pry bar is on the second shelf on the left, hanging on 2 16-penny nails. The box of lag screws is on the same shelf, the red metal box with the hinged lid. Bring both to the greenhouse. Bring the combination lock key on the ring with the house key. It opens the padlock. The floor panels are numbered on their undersides, 1 through 6, starting from the door end. Begin with panel 1 and work toward the far wall in order. Do not skip panels. Do not rush. She found the shed exactly as described. The green metal door ran on a slide bolt that had been recently oiled. It moved without resistance, without sound. Inside, the shed smelled of linseed oil and cold iron, and the tools were hung on pegboard in rows, each one outlined in pencil on the board behind it so you could see at a glance what was missing. Nothing was missing. The pry bar was a 30-inch Estwing with a blue vinyl grip, the steel worn bright at the working end from use. It was heavier than she expected. She lifted it off its nails and tucked it under her arm, and took the red metal box from the shelf beside it. The box rattled with quarter-inch lag screws, more than 100 of them, the galvanized kind used for structural connections. She carried both items to the greenhouse. The combination lock opened on the first try. She unwound the shackle, pulled the hasp free, and pushed the greenhouse door open on hinges that swung without protest. The air inside was warm and close, and smelled of damp soil and rosemary, and the particular green smell of plants respiring in an enclosed space. It was 20 degrees warmer than outside. The grow light hummed faintly overhead. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let her eyes adjust, then stepped in and set the pry bar and the screw box down on the potting bench that ran along the left-hand wall. She looked at the floor. The cedar planking ran the length of the greenhouse, 12-inch wide tongue and groove boards, the surface worn smooth and faintly darkened with years of foot traffic and spilled water. If there were seams between panels, they were not obvious. She crouched and looked more carefully. They were there. The seams were tight. Warren had been careful, but running her finger along the floor, she could find them, fine lines crossing the full width of the structure at intervals of roughly 6 feet. 6 panels, each 6 feet long, filling the 40-foot run of the greenhouse floor. She found the first panel by working from the door end, pressing along the near edge with her fingers until she located the gap wide enough to seat the pry bar. She worked the flat end of the Estwing into the seam and leaned on the handle. The panel held for a moment, the tongue and groove joint resisting, and then with a dry crack like a knuckle popping, it broke free on one side, and she levered it up. The underside showed rough-cut cedar and, in black marker in her father's handwriting, the number 1. Beneath the first panel was bare earth, raked flat and dry. Nothing else. She replaced the panel and moved to the second. Same result. Raked earth, nothing placed or buried. The underside numbered in marker. She was beginning to sweat despite the cool draft from the door she had left open behind her. The pry bar raised blisters on her right palm between the thumb and forefinger. She worked her jacket off without setting the bar down and draped it over the potting bench and kept going. The third panel came up easier than the first two, the joint having loosened slightly with the temperature change. Beneath it, again, only earth. She was aware of the folding chair beside her, the aluminum legs framing the section of floor she was working through. She did not sit in it. The fourth panel required more force. She had to work the pry bar into 3 different points along the seam before the joint gave, and when it did, the panel came up fast and she stumbled back a half step and caught herself on the potting bench. Her right hand was bleeding slightly at the base of the thumb where the grip had twisted. She wiped it on the thigh of her jeans and looked down into the space the panel had opened. Earth again, raked flat, but this time something was lying in it. A length of half-inch copper pipe, capped at both ends with soldered fittings, running the full width of the panel opening. She reached down and picked it up. It was light. She worked one of the soldered caps off with the blade of a screwdriver from the potting bench and tipped the pipe. A rolled paper slid out, a hand-drawn map of the property, the house and greenhouse, and shed marked in pencil. The lane to County Road 7, and at the edge of the map, a second parcel indicated with a dotted border and the words Grain Mill, CR 14, written in her father's hand. She set the map carefully on the potting bench and went back to the floor. The 5th panel. This one she had to work for 4 full minutes, the joint refusing. the cedar swollen slightly at one end from years of moisture rising through the soil. She moved the pry bar twice, changed her angle, put her full weight on the handle. The blisters on her right palm had opened. When the panel finally gave it, did so all at once, the entire board lifting in a single clean motion, and she lowered it to the floor beside her and looked down and was very still for a moment. Beneath panel 5, sitting in a shallow, cedar-lined recess built into the earth, was a steel strong box. 16 inches long, 10 inches wide, 4 inches deep, with a welded seam and a 4-digit combination lock mounted flush on the front face. The steel was painted gray and showed no rust. Warren had laid it in a bed of silica gel packets to keep the moisture out. There were perhaps 20 of the small white packets arranged around the box like a border. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. The combination. She thought about it for less than a minute before she tried the year she was born. 1, 9, 8, 9. She turned the last dial and pressed the release button on the face of the box. It opened with a soft click that was very loud in the quiet of the greenhouse. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth and held with a rubber band, were 2 bundles she could not yet fully make out. Beneath them, a brass key on a paper tag, and on top of everything, placed so it would be the first thing seen, a sealed envelope. Smaller than the attorney's envelope, her name on the front in the same block letters but written more slowly than the instructions. She could tell by the pressure of the pencil, the slight thickening of each stroke. The way you write when you are trying to get something exactly right. She replaced the floor panels in order, working backward from 5 to 1, tapping the tongue and groove joints home with the heel of her hand. The 6th panel she had never opened. She left it as Warren had left it, flush and tight, the seam nearly invisible against the ones beside it. She set the strongbox on the potting bench beside the map and the copper pipe, then stood with her back against the bench and looked at the greenhouse around her, the tomato stakes, the lettuce trays, the rosemary in its half barrel, and let her breathing slow. The grow light hummed. Outside, through the wavy glass, the afternoon had gone the color of pewter. She had been in the greenhouse for nearly 2 hours without noticing the time pass. Her right hand had stiffened around the blisters. She flexed it twice, winced, and pressed a strip of paper toweling from the bench roll against the open one at the base of her thumb. The cut was not deep, but it was in a bad place, the kind of small injury that announces itself every time you close your fist. She held the toweling in place and carried the strongbox to the house under her left arm, the atlas tucked under the same arm, the pry bar left on the bench. She set the box on the kitchen table next to the envelope she had already opened. She washed her hands at the porcelain sink, cold water first because the hot took a long time to arrive, and dried them on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Then she put the percolator on and sat down at the table and looked at the sealed envelope on top of the strongbox for a long time without opening it. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound of tires on the gravel lane. Not a fast sound. A careful one, the way people drive on other people's property when they are not certain of their welcome. She went to the window above the sink and looked out. A green pickup truck, an older model, had stopped at the edge of the lane near the back porch steps. A woman was getting out of it, older, wide-shouldered, wearing a canvas barn coat and work boots and a knitted hat pulled down to her eyebrows. She was carrying a thermos in one hand and something wrapped in a dish towel in the other. She moved across the gravel with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has crossed a yard 10,000 times and sees no reason to change her pace. Nora opened the back door before the woman reached the porch steps. The woman looked up and nodded once, as though confirming something she had already known. She said her name was Dolores Fitch, that she farmed the adjacent property to the north, that she and Warren had been neighbors for 23 years. She said it the way you state a fact that requires no decoration. She held out the thermos and the dish towel bundle, and said she had brought coffee and a sandwich and thought Nora might be getting to the point in the day where both would be useful. She did not ask what Nora had found. She did not ask how long she was staying or what she planned to do with the property. She simply stood on the porch steps with the thermos extended and waited. Nora took both and stepped back from the door. Dolores came in without being explicitly invited, in the manner of someone who understands that the invitation is implied by the stepping back, and settled herself into the chair across the table from where Nora had been sitting. She did not look at the strong box, or if she noticed it, she gave no sign. She unzipped her barn coat but did not take it off, which told Nora she did not intend to stay long, not out of unwillingness, but out of a practiced sense of what the moment required. She folded her hands on the table. The kitchen was quiet. Nora set the thermos and the dish towel on the counter and unwrapped the sandwich. Thick white bread, sliced turkey, yellow mustard, a leaf of lettuce. The kind of sandwich made by someone who believes in feeding people plainly and adequately rather than impressively. She brought it to the table on the dish towel and sat down. She took a bite. It was very good. She said so. Dolores nodded and said Warren had grown the lettuce, that she had taken cuttings from his greenhouse in September, when it was clear he wasn't going to make it to the end of the year, and that she had been keeping a flat of them going on her kitchen windowsill since then. She said this without sentiment. She said it as plain information. They sat together for perhaps 20 minutes. Dolores asked once whether the drive down had been bad, and Nora said no. Not bad, and that was the extent of the personal questions. Dolores talked about the weather coming in off the ridge, about the fact that the county had graded County Road 7 the previous spring for the first time in 4 years. About a heifer she was expecting to calve early that would mean cold night barn checks for the next 6 weeks. Small talk, but not empty talk. The kind of talk that fills a room with ordinary life when ordinary life is what is needed most. Nora ate her sandwich and drank the coffee from the thermos lid, which Dolores had poured for her without asking, and found that the tightness in her chest loosened slightly with each passing minute, the way a knot works loose when you stop pulling on it. When Dolores stood to leave, she gathered the dish towel and the thermos cap and set them in her coat pocket. Nora reached for her purse on the counter and took out a $10 bill and held it toward her. Dolores looked at it for a moment. She shook her head once. She said, "Warren would have done the same." She said it the same way she had said everything else. No emphasis, no decoration, as though it were simply the clearest way to explain the transaction. She buttoned the top button of her barn coat and went to the back door. She paused with her hand on the frame and turned back and looked at Nora directly for the first time since she had arrived. She said, "He talked about you." Then she went out and across the gravel and got into the green pickup and drove back up the lane at the same careful speed she had arrived at, and turned onto County Road 7 and was gone. Nora stood at the back door and watched the truck until it disappeared around the bend in the road. The cold came in through the open door and pooled around her feet. She did not move to close it for a full minute. She was thinking about the $10 bill still in her hand, and the thermos lid with its ghost ring of coffee, and the lettuce in the sandwich that had grown under her father's grow light in the greenhouse 40 feet behind her. She pressed the bill flat against her sternum with the heel of her hand and held it there. Then she closed the door and went back to the kitchen table and sat down in front of the sealed envelope and picked it up. The envelope opened cleanly along the fold. Inside were 4 pages of the same lined paper as the attorney's instructions, covered front and back in her father's block letters, the pencil pressed firmly enough that she could feel the indentations on the reverse side of each page when she turned them over. At the top of the first page, in the right-hand corner, he had written the date, March 3rd, 2 years before he died. Beneath that, no salutation, no dear Nora, no formal opening of any kind. He had simply begun. He wrote, "I have been trying to write this for about 6 years, and I have thrown away more starts than I can count. I am going to try to just say the plain things and trust you to understand them. I was not a man who was easy to be near. I know that. Your mother knew it before you were old enough to, and she was right to go when she did, though I spent a long time not believing that. I want to say first, and say it clearly, that the distance between us was my doing and not yours. You were 16, and you needed a father who could say things out loud, and I could not do it. That is not an excuse, it is just the true description of what happened." He wrote about the greenhouse. He had built it the summer after Nora left for college, over the course of 3 weekends. Using cedar, he milled himself from 2 white pines that had come down in a storm on the back of the property. He wrote that he had not known, when he started building it, what he was building it for. He said it became clear to him over the first winter that the greenhouse was what happened when you needed to prove to yourself that you could tend something without failing it. He had failed the tomatoes the first year, lost them all to a fungal blight he hadn't known how to read. He had tried again the second year. By the third year, he had learned what the plants needed and gave it to them consistently, and they came back reliably. And he found that this steadiness, the daily act of checking and watering and staking, was the thing he had needed without knowing what to call it. "If you are reading this," he wrote on the second page, "then you opened the floor yourself, the way I asked. I want to explain why I asked that. There is money in the box. $61,400 saved over 31 years in amounts ranging from $9 to $400, whatever I could set aside from the station work and the odd jobs. I want you to have it, but I did not want to simply leave you a box. I wanted you to work for the floor first. Not as a punishment, because I know you, even from a distance, and I know that if you worked for it yourself, you would feel that it was yours, in a way that a handed thing never feels entirely yours. You were always like that, even as a child." The station work he referred to was a roadside service station on Route 63 that Warren had run for 11 years before the franchise closed, and left him with the building and the lot and no brand to put on the sign. He had converted it to a general repair shop and run it that way until his hands gave out, renting the bays out to a younger mechanic in the last 3 years. He wrote about the shop without complaint, as though the closing of the franchise and the subsequent reduction in income were simply weather. Things that happened, that you adjusted to, that you did not spend energy resenting. He wrote about the savings the same way. Small amounts, regular intervals, a coffee can in the first year, and then a proper account. Once there was enough to open one. He did not write about it as sacrifice. He wrote about it as a habit, the way the greenhouse was a habit. On the third page, he wrote about the mill. The grain mill on County Road 14 had come up for tax sale in the spring of 1996, and Warren had bought it for $4,200 at the county courthouse steps on a Tuesday morning when no one else showed up to bid. He paid the back taxes and the filing fees and held the deed in the coffee can for 2 years while he thought about what to do with it. He paid the property taxes each year without fail. He did nothing with the structure for a long time, he wrote, because he did not know what it wanted to be yet, and he had learned from the greenhouse that it was better to wait and listen than to decide too quickly. He paid the mill off in full in the fall of 1998. The brass key in the strongbox, he wrote, opens the mill's front door. The deed is in the red metal box with the lag screws in a wax paper envelope at the bottom. If you go to the mill, he wrote near the bottom of the third page, go on a morning when the light is coming from the east. There is a window on the east wall of the main floor, an old 12/12 double hung that I reglazed in 2004. And when the morning light comes through it at the right angle, it hits the dust in the air, and the place looks the way I imagine it looked when it was running. I have sat in that light many times. I think you would like it. I think you would know what to do with the building, which is more than I ever did. I am leaving it to you because it deserves someone who will decide for it, and I believe you are that person." The fourth page was shorter than the others. He wrote, "I am not going to tell you what to do with any of it. The money, the mill, the greenhouse, the house. Those are yours to decide. And I trust your judgment more than you probably believe I do. What I want to say, and what I have been trying to say for 6 years in all the letters I threw away, is that I watched you from a distance, the way a person watches a thing they love when they are afraid that getting closer will damage it. I know that is a terrible reason for silence. I know it does not help you to hear it now, but it is true, and I would rather you have the true thing than a better-sounding version of it. I tended the greenhouse every day for 31 years. Every day, without exception. I want you to know that I thought about you every one of those days, that I was glad you existed in the world, that I am glad. Still," he had signed it, "Warren." Below the signature in smaller letters, as though added after he had put the pen down and then picked it up again, "I left the chair there for you." Nora set the last page down on the table with the others. The percolator had gone quiet on the stove. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was draining out of the sky over the ridge, the color fading from pewter to the blue-gray of wood ash, and the first stars were becoming visible above the tree line to the east. She sat with her hands flat on the table on either side of the 4 pages, and did not move for a long time. The house was very still. In the greenhouse, 40 feet away through the cold and the dark, the grow light had switched on for the evening, and its amber glow lay across the cedar floor in a long, warm rectangle, the same as it had every evening for 31 years, patient and steady, and keeping its watch. She stayed 2 nights at the house before driving back to Roanoke to collect the rest of her things. The first night she slept in Warren's bed because it was the only made-up bed in the house, and she lay awake for a long time, listening to the baseboard heaters tick and the wind move through the cedar framing of the greenhouse 40 feet away, a low creak at irregular intervals, like a ship settling at anchor. The second morning, she found the wax paper envelope in the red metal box beneath the lag screws, exactly where Warren had said it would be. She spread the deed documents on the kitchen table beside his letter and read through them twice. The mill parcel was 4.3 acres, the stone building assessed at a nominal value, the property taxes current through the end of the year, paid in full in January by a check drawn on a post office box account she had not known existed. Everything was in order. Everything had always been in order. That was the thing she was beginning to understand about her father. Not that he had been absent exactly, but that he had been orderly in his absence, maintaining things from a distance with the same consistency he brought to the greenhouse floor. She drove back to Roanoke on a Friday and spent the weekend closing out the last of what needed closing. She returned the library book she found in Warren's nightstand, A History of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, 3 weeks overdue, which cost her $4.30 at the Harlan Falls branch, and arranged with a moving company to transport her storage unit to the house on County Road 7 the following Thursday. The friend she had been planning to move in with was understanding in the way that good friends are when something unexpected changes your plans for the better rather than the worse. Nora packed what remained in her apartment into the Subaru in 2 loads and drove back down on a Wednesday evening, arriving after dark, the gravel lane lit only by her headlights and the amber glow of the greenhouse visible from the road. She had been back at the house for 3 days when the silver sedan came up the lane on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a new car, the kind of car that looks slightly out of place on a dirt road, and it came at the same careful speed as Dolores had come, but with a different quality to it. The carefulness of someone calculating rather than someone being considerate. Nora was on the back porch with a cup of coffee watching the greenhouse when she heard the tires, and she came around the side of the house to meet the car as it stopped near the front porch steps. The man who got out was somewhere in his mid-50s, neatly dressed in khaki trousers and a quilted vest over a collared shirt, his hair combed and his shoes clean, in a way that suggested he had not walked far in them. He smiled at her from the bottom of the porch steps. He said his name was Dale Pruitt. Pruitt said he was in property development, that he represented a group of investors with interests in the county, and that he had been made aware, through the normal course of public record, that Warren Callum's estate had recently transferred to a sole heir. He said it pleasantly and without hurry, the way a man says something he has said before, and found to be an effective opener. He asked if she had a few minutes. She said she had a few minutes. She did not invite him onto the porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands at his sides and looked up at her with the steady, patient expression of a man who does not mind being kept at a slight disadvantage because he believes the conversation will go his way regardless. He knew about the mill. He said so directly, which she noted. He was not pretending to know less than he knew, which was either honesty or a particular kind of confidence, and she was not yet sure which. He said the mill parcel on County Road 14 was an interesting piece of property, that the stone construction was unusual in the county, that the acreage had some attractive features from a development standpoint. He said his group had been watching the parcel for some time, in anticipation of it eventually becoming available. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said he was prepared to offer $38,000 cash with a 30-day close, no inspection contingency, no complications. He said the word complications the way people say it when they want you to begin thinking about what the complications might be. She asked him what kind of development he had in mind. He said the group had not finalized plans, but that the County Road 14 corridor was seeing increased interest in light of some long-term infrastructure discussions at the county level. He said the phrase infrastructure discussions in the tone of someone who believes the information is valuable and is giving it to you as a courtesy. He mentioned that older structures in unincorporated areas sometimes attracted code enforcement attention, particularly when ownership changed and a new review was triggered. He did not say this as a threat. He said it as information. He said it calmly, looking up at her from the bottom step, his hands still at his sides, the silver sedan sitting behind him on the gravel with its engine cooling in the November air. Nora looked at him for a moment without answering. She thought about the east-facing window her father had reglazed in 2004, and the morning light he had described in the letter, and the word deserves, which Warren had used when he wrote about the building. It deserves someone who will decide for it. Pruitt waited. He was good at waiting. She told him she hadn't made any decisions about the property yet. He nodded as though this were a reasonable and expected answer. He took a card from the breast pocket of his quilted vest and held it out to her. She came down one step and took it. The card was heavy stock, cream-colored, his name and a cell number, and the words Pruitt Land Holdings in a clean serif font. Nothing else. He thanked her for her time and went back to the silver sedan and reversed out of the lane with practiced ease, turning onto County Road 7 without stopping, and was gone in under a minute. Nora stood on the porch step with the card in her hand and listened to the sound of his engine fade into the distance. Then she went inside and set the card face down on the kitchen table. Not thrown away. Face down, she sat across from it and looked at the strongbox on the far end of the table and at Warren's letter folded neatly on top of it. And she thought about the $38,000 Pruitt had offered against the $61,400 already in the box. And she thought about the word complications. And she thought about her father sitting in an aluminum chair looking at a cedar floor for 31 years and keeping his word to everything he tended. She got up and put the percolator on. She retrieved the county deed records from the wax paper envelope. She sat back down and began to read them carefully, from the beginning, the way you read something when you are looking for the thing someone hopes you will not find. She drove to the mill on a Thursday morning, leaving the house before 8 with the brass key on the ring with the house key and a thermos from the percolator on the passenger seat. County Road 14 ran east off Route 9, past a poultry operation and 2 dairy farms and a stretch of second-growth timber that pressed close to the road on both sides. the bare branches making the same gray tunnel she had driven through on her way to the house for the first time. The mill appeared at the end of a gravel track marked by a cedar post with no sign on it, just the post, which was enough if you knew what you were looking for. She turned in and drove slowly, and stopped when the building came into view through the trees. It was a stone building, larger than she had expected. The walls laid in coursed rubble fieldstone 2 feet thick. The mortar lines raked clean and repointed in sections where the original had failed. The roof was standing seam metal, dark green, sound along its full length. No visible sag or separation at the ridge. A mill race ran along the north side of the building, dry now, the wooden flume long gone but the stone channel intact and filled with dead leaves and the skeletal remains of last summer's ironweed. The east wall faced her as she approached, and in it, at the height of a second floor, was the window her father had described. A 12/12 double-hung, the glazing clear and true in its reglazed sash, waiting for the morning light that was already beginning to find it from across the ridge. The brass key turned in the lock with the smooth resistance of a well-made mechanism that had been recently oiled. Inside, the air was cold and dry, and smelled of old stone and the particular neutral dustiness of a sealed space that has been kept structurally sound. The main floor was open and high-ceilinged, the original timber framing intact overhead, the mortise and tenon joinery at the bents still tight after 140 years of seasonal movement. Against the north wall stood the equipment her father had mentioned in his letter. A Hobart commercial mixer, a museum piece in cast iron and nickel-plated steel, and beyond it the grain auger in its wooden housing, the flighting still true, the shaft turning freely when she pushed it with her hand. The floor was wide plank pine, dusty but unrotted, the boards running the full 30-foot width of the building without a splice. She walked the length of the room and back and stood at the east window as the morning light came through it, exactly as Warren had described, catching the suspended dust in long amber shafts that fell across the pine floor at a low angle and made the room look for a moment like something that had just been opened rather than something that had been waiting. She called Gerald Marsh from the parking area outside the mill before she drove into Harlan Falls. She told him about Dale Pruitt's visit and his offer. She asked about the infrastructure discussions Pruitt had mentioned. Marsh was quiet for a moment and then said that to his knowledge there were no active county road expansion plans affecting County Road 14, that the corridor had been discussed in a planning session 2 years prior and tabled without action, and that the session minutes were public record and available at the county clerk's office. He said this without editorializing. He gave her the name of a local attorney who handled property matters and suggested Nora call her before responding to Pruitt in any form. The attorney's name was Patricia Sears. Her office was above a hardware store on the main street of Harlan Falls, up a narrow staircase with a brass handrail worn to a warm glow at the grip. Sears was perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a chain and a desk covered in organized stacks of paper that she navigated without looking down. She reviewed the deed documents Nora brought her in 20 minutes and said the title was clean. The property taxes current. The transfer from Warren's estate to Nora straightforward and already recorded correctly. She said Pruitt's offer of $38,000 was low by a margin she found notable. She said the stone construction alone, combined with the intact equipment and the acreage, placed the property's assessed value at nearly double that figure, and that a motivated buyer in the right market could reasonably pay more. She said Nora was under no obligation to respond to Pruitt at all, and that if he contacted her again, she was welcome to refer him to Sears's office. She charged Nora $45 for the consultation. Nora paid in cash from the Strongbox. It was Patricia Sears who first mentioned the post office box account. She had pulled the county tax records as part of her title review and noticed that the property taxes on 4 parcels along County Road 7 had been paid annually from a post office box account registered to a business name, Harlan Tending Services, that did not appear to have any other public presence. She had cross-referenced the account opening date, October of 2008, the month the second of the 4 families on the road had fallen behind on their payments. Sears said she had no way to confirm the connection without further research, but that the pattern was consistent and the timing was not coincidental. She said it in the plain way she said everything. Nora sat very still in the chair across from Sears's desk and pressed her hands flat on her thighs. The families themselves, it emerged over the following days, had known or suspected for some time. A mechanic named Roy Elam, who operated a one-bay shop off Route 9, stopped by the house on a Saturday morning, having heard through Dolores that Warren's daughter was in residence. He was a compact man in his late 40s with grease permanently in the creases of his knuckles and the manner of someone who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and was going to say it regardless. He said Warren had paid the property taxes on his family's land for 6 consecutive years starting in 2008, anonymously, through the post office box, and that Roy's father had figured out the source in 2012, but had honored Warren's apparent wish for silence and never said a word about it publicly. Roy said his father had died in 2019 and had asked Roy to find a way to say thank you to Warren someday. He said he was sorry he had run out of time to do it while Warren was alive. He did not elaborate on that. He stood on the porch and said what he had come to say, and then thanked Nora for listening and went back to his truck. A woman named Carol Briggs came the following Tuesday with a jar of tomato preserves, Warren's variety, a paste tomato he had grown from seed he had been saving and replanting since the mid-90s. A deep red Amish paste with a flavor that Carol said you could not find at any store because it didn't exist at any store. It only existed in Warren's greenhouse, and now, through the cuttings, Dolores and Carol and 2 other women on the road had been quietly propagating, in their own. She set the jar on the kitchen counter and said Warren had given starts to anyone who asked and to some people who hadn't, and that there were probably 40 households in the county growing his tomato variety without knowing whose it was. She said it the way you say something you find both funny and sad, and have not yet decided which it is more. Pruitt did not call and did not return. His card stayed face down on the kitchen table for 11 days, and then Nora put it in the recycling bin under the sink. And that was the end of it. 3 weeks after Carol Briggs left the jar of tomato preserves on the counter, Nora replanted the greenhouse. She had spent 2 days reading the notes Warren kept in a composition book on the potting bench, a record of every planting, every failure, every adjustment going back 14 years, written in the same block letters as everything else he wrote, dated and annotated with a plainness that made it feel less like a journal and more like a log kept by someone who understood that the information would be useful to whoever came after. She followed his notes for the tomato beds first, mixing his recorded ratio of compost to perlite to topsoil in the proportions he had arrived at by year 3. She staked the new starts with cedar lath cut from the stack in the shed, tied them with strips of cotton torn from an old shirt she found in the rag box. She worked for most of 2 days without stopping for anything other than coffee and the sandwich she made herself at noon standing at the kitchen counter. The second bed she planted with lettuces from the flat Dolores had been keeping on her windowsill since September. Dolores brought them over on a Sunday morning without being asked, arriving again at the unhurried pace of someone who has decided a thing and sees no reason to delay it. She carried the flat in both hands and set it on the potting bench and showed Nora the root development on the strongest starts, pressing a thumb gently into the soil around one stem to demonstrate the depth without disturbing the plant. She stayed for 40 minutes. She drank 1 cup of coffee and did not stay for a second. Before she left, she looked around the greenhouse with the expression of a person seeing a thing restored to a condition they remember and are glad to see again, and she said, "He would like this." She said it once, to no one in particular, and then she went. Nora spent the better part of a week at the mill in the second half of December. She had called Patricia Sears and asked whether the community room, a large secondary space on the ground floor, separate from the main milling area, with its own exterior door on the south side, could be made available for public use without triggering a change of use review under the county building code. Sears researched the question and called back 2 days later to say that occasional community use of an agricultural structure did not require a permit provided no permanent alterations were made and no fees were charged. Nora wrote a notice on a piece of cardstock in plain block letters. Her father's style of handwriting, she had noticed, was becoming her own, and tacked it to the cedar post at the entrance to the gravel track. Community room available. No charge. Call to arrange. She put the number of the landline at the house, a phone she had found in a kitchen drawer still connected to the wall jack, still working. The first call came on a Wednesday from a woman who ran a twice-monthly quilting group that had lost its meeting space when the Grange Hall on Route 9 closed for renovations. Nora drove out and unlocked the south door and showed her the room. It was cold and would need a propane heater, which Nora said she would arrange. The woman walked the space and nodded and said it would do well. She shook Nora's hand at the door and said she had known Warren slightly, that he had once replaced a broken spoke in her husband's hay tedder without charging for the labor. That her husband had never forgotten it. She said this on her way out, over her shoulder, not as the point of the visit but as something that simply wanted saying. Nora stood in the south doorway after the woman's car had gone and looked at the mill race and the bare ironweed stems in the dry stone channel and the ridgeline beyond. And the morning light moved through the east window and across the pine floor behind her. And she stood in it for a moment before locking up. It was the second week of January when the young woman appeared at the front door of the house on County Road 7. Nora heard the knock at 4:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, the light already going gray and the temperature dropping fast toward a forecast hard freeze. She opened the door to a woman perhaps 25, thin in the way of someone who has been traveling without eating regularly, with a canvas backpack over one shoulder and a coat not quite heavy enough for the weather. She had a car, an old Civic hatchback with a cracked taillight, sitting at the end of the lane with the hazard lights blinking. She said she had run low on fuel and her phone was dead, and she had knocked on 2 doors before this one without an answer, and she was sorry to bother, but could she possibly use a phone or get directions to the nearest fuel station? Nora looked at her for a moment. She looked at the coat. She said to come in out of the cold, and she put the percolator on and filled a thermos while the coffee ran. She made a sandwich: white bread, sliced turkey, yellow mustard, a leaf of lettuce from the greenhouse, the same sandwich Dolores had brought to her 6 weeks earlier, and set it on the table without making a point of it. She called Roy Elam at the One Bay shop off Route 9, who said he had a 2-gallon can and would drive it out. She told the young woman Roy would be there in 20 minutes. The young woman sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the thermos lid and ate the sandwich in 4 bites and did not apologize for her appetite, which Nora respected. She asked if Nora lived here alone, and Nora said she did for now. And the young woman nodded and looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of someone who recognizes an orderly and considered life and is taking note of what it looks like. Roy arrived in 18 minutes with the fuel can and would not take anything for it. The young woman thanked Nora at the door, the thermos still in her hand because Nora had told her to keep it, and went down the porch steps to her car. She paused at the bottom step and turned back and said she hoped things went well for Nora, which was a plain thing to say, and was said plainly. Nora raised a hand from the doorframe. The Civic's engine turned over on the second try, and its headlights came on, and it moved slowly up the lane and turned onto County Road 7 and was gone. The cracked tail light, a small red smear in the early dark. Nora stood in the doorway until the sound of the engine faded, then went back inside. She took her coffee to the greenhouse. The grow light was on, the amber rectangle falling across the cedar floor, the way it had fallen every evening for 31 years. The rosemary in the half-barrel near the far wall had put out new growth, pale green at the tips against the older, darker stems. The tomato starts were holding steady in their beds, the first true leaves fully open now, the stems beginning to thicken at the base. She set her coffee on the potting bench and picked up the folding aluminum chair from the center of the floor and carried it to the bench and sat down in it. She looked at the floor for a while. Then she looked at the plants. Then she picked up her coffee and drank it while it was still warm and listened to the greenhouse settle around her in the cold, the cedar framing making its low creaking sound against the wind off the ridge, patient and steady, the same as it always had. Some people tend things quietly for a long time, and only after they are gone does anyone understand what was being grown.